Coming up today on the Bolt Retort, was Josh Shapiro ever an Israeli spy? How did Tim Walz ever get past vetting processes? And is the world ready for Kamala Harris to go again? Let's get into it. Welcome to the Bolt Retort. Joining me this week is political reporter for National Review, Audrey Fahlberg. Audrey, thank you so much for joining me. I want to get straight into something, if that's okay, and that is this incredible profile in The Atlantic of Josh Shapiro's upcoming memoir, which includes this fascinating detail from his screening process for being Kamala Harris's running mate. Now, bear with me, it's a bit of a long quote here. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro was already irritated by what he describes as unnecessarily contentious questions from the team vetting him to be Kamala Harris's running mate when one senior aide made one final inquiry. Have you ever been an agent of the Israeli government? The question came from President Biden's former White House counsel Dana Remus, who was a key member of Harris's vice presidential search team. Shapiro, one of the most well-known Jewish elected officials in the country, and one of the least three Jewish politicians considering a run for the 2028 Democratic presidential nomination, says he took umbrage at the question. Had I been a double agent for Israel? Was she kidding? I told her how offensive that question was. The exchange became even more tense, he writes, when Remus asked whether Shapiro had ever spoken with an undercover Israeli agent. When you read that, what were your reactions?
You know, it came as no surprise that he would include this in his book because remember, he was being considered to be a, vice presidential candidate for Kamala Harris. They already clearly did not hit it off. And then remember, in her own memoir, she included a remark that he allegedly made in the VP's residence where he was, allegedly telling people about, what art he'd like to put on the wall in the VP's residence. So, that was a shot across the bow already in Kamala Harris's book. So it's no surprise to me that he would include his own kind of swipe at Kamala Harris's team. But look, clearly this is very offensive to him. He is Jewish. He hasn't backed down from his pro-Israel beliefs while in office. And, he's clearly miffed and feels like that is one of the reasons why Kamala Harris, didn't ultimately pick him. Of course, if we go back to the summer of 2024, he kind of pushed back on the kind of insinuation that it was Kamala Harris's decision to not move forward with him for VP. Of course, she went with Tim Walz, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. But he kind of suggested that he didn't actually want the job. But look, clearly he was offended by this. He had done some work with the IDF, in Israel. Again, very proud of his pro-Israel views, a Jewish Democrat. So clearly very miffed still by this, the fact that he would include this in his book.
The other detail from me was like the follow-up question after "Are you an Israeli double agent?" was have you ever talked to an undercover Israeli spy? To which how would you know? How would he ever know if he'd done that? But it's like the kind of question that you only ask if you are hoping this guy says no, to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. Clearly, he's just extremely offended by this. And again, remember, the Gaza issue is such a pertinent one, across the world, obviously, but particularly in democratic politics in America. We're seeing a little bit of this divide growing on the right, but it's mostly kind of a left-wing issue where Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, they were seen as typical kind of mainstream pro-Israel views. But then, of course, as the war continued in Gaza, throughout the election, they were getting a lot of flack from their leftmost flank. Remember, there was also that uncommitted vote in Michigan where there were, a swath of, Muslim Arab voters who were saying, we can't vote for any Democratic candidate, even if it's Joe Biden, against Trump, the most hated politician in Democratic politics. Look, I think moving forward, it's going to be really interesting because clearly this guy has presidential aspirations of his own. I don't imagine this Gaza issue going anywhere. So this is going to continue to be a tension for him, but he's signifying he wants to get ahead of that issue here.
Do you reckon just the way that the Gaza issue, the way the Israel issue has changed in the last 6 months. Like, I'm speaking from Australia. I think the Bondi massacre, which I know has made its way into the US thing, it's changed how this country speaks about Israel and Gaza. You can't really get away with being too anti-Israel anymore. Is it a similar move in America? Are Democrats less likely to be outspoken against Israel than they were, say, in the last election race? Do you think it's going to be as hot an issue for the next election?
I don't think it will be as hot because the war has died down in Israel. But that said, obviously the Bondi massacre was a tragedy. It Unfortunately, I don't think it's really had much of an impact on Democratic politics here. I had a story on a Senate candidate in Michigan, where again, that's home to Dearborn, which is a majority Arab city. Outside of Detroit, very kind of anti-Israel, a lot of anti-Israel sentiment in Michigan. And I wrote a story on this Senate candidate. There's this three-way Senate race there, where there's a really pro-Israel Democrat and a really anti-Israel Democrat, and then there's one candidate in the middle her husband is Jewish. She's been kind of mainstream on the issue, but in October she had this flip where she called it a genocide, and now she's trying to toggle between both camps. So you do have some people who are on either side of the issue, but then some people who are kind of in the middle of the Democratic Party struggling how to move forward, and they're seen as kind of traitors to both sides. So I think that's another dynamic that's going to be playing out, in the next cycle.
Yeah. So back to the Kamala Harris angle from this Atlantic thing. There was another interesting. So you brought up before that Josh Shapiro rubbed Kamala up the wrong way by saying, where can I put my artwork? Can the Smithsonian donate anything? Like, what type of couches can I get in? I can see how that would anger you. But the other angle I was getting from what Kamala Harris was saying, both in the Atlantic and otherwise, was that she was incredibly frustrated in her time as vice president by how little power she had. She just felt she was like a fly on the wall. It was all with Biden. She wished she could have made changes, whatever changes she wanted to make. She's never really identified, but she wanted to make them anyway. But we have two sides of Kamala Harris now. We have the side that says, I wish I had more power as vice president. And then this other side that says, whoever would be my vice president has absolutely no more power than I had. So, like, which one is she? Can you be both? Is it just pure vindictiveness?
To get into the mind of Kamala Harris is a tricky task to do. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Biden, they uplifted her as the border czar. Democrats hate when you say that, but it's true. They gave her the task. A lot of vice presidents have a task. I think, notably, Vice President Vance does not have a task, which is a good thing, because if you have a task, you're inevitably going to fall short, and then you're going to get the blame either from your party or the other party. That said, clearly Biden's inner circle didn't feel like they could trust her. They didn't take her super seriously, and they didn't give her they didn't really uplift her or showcase her in any way. But then lo and behold, once Joe Biden finally, after that disastrous debate, she finally, becomes the de facto nominee. They don't have any sort of nomination process. She's figuring out, okay, who do I want to be my running mate during this 3-month cycle? She looks at somebody like Josh Shapiro, who's clearly extremely ambitious, obviously wants to be president, very outspoken. And she probably thinks to herself, okay, this guy is going to outshine me, right? And I'm tired of being outshined already in the VP's residence. So, after this fraud scandal broke out in Minnesota, well, it actually broke out a while ago, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. I was thinking to myself, like, how did Tim Walz get through this VP vetting process? And I think one of the reasons is that, Kamala Harris looked at him. He comes across as this really folksy guy. I lost track of the number of times campaign reporters called him folksy. But she saw a guy who has a close-knit family, seems really friendly, and is relatively non-controversial in her mind. So she thinks, okay, he's the path of least resistance. And that was kind of her calculus for picking a VP nominee.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, but let's really unpack that, right? So Josh Shapiro gets asked, you an Israeli spy, have you ever talked to an Israeli spy? There's all these anti-Israel questions. It is full on. It's offensive, but it is very full on. And I know there's like some backgrounding now. Actually, Tim Walz had the same questions about his links to China, but it just strikes me that, like, why were you so gung-ho on getting to the bottom of Josh Shapiro, if there is a bottom to get to, but like, you're so gung-ho on getting to the bottom of Josh Shapiro, but all of this fraud stuff, which, as you write in the National Review, like, that's his undoing. all this fraud stuff, that's just, we can figure that out in the campaign. We don't really need to worry about that. How does that not get flagged as this is potentially, like, this could sink us?
So, in fairness, that really wasn't discussed much by Republicans during the campaign. What's so fascinating is, a lot of the Somali fraud angle with the daycares. That's something that's really blown up in recent months. There's been a lot of investigative reporting on that, as there should be. But a ton of this fraud stuff had already been really public, even years before the 2024 election. In 2022, I believe, the Justice Department under Joe Biden, again, a Democratic president, while Kamala Harris was in office, indicted, I believe, 47 individuals for what's called this Feeding Our Future. It's a new federal nutrition assistance program, federally funded in Minnesota, for fraud. So that's already dozens of people who were indicted under this program that was, extremely fraudulent under Walz's tenure. Along with that, there was already, a few weeks before Tim Walz was tapped to be her VP nominee, there were a bunch of state legislative audits that came out about a bunch of other fraud, waste, and mismanagement that had occurred under the Walz administration in a bunch of different state level agencies. So again, while the Somali angle wasn't completely clear until recently, a lot of this stuff was really public. And as I reported in my piece last week, the Harris vetting team, they did find this and they saw it as a potential, red flag, potential weakness. But again, they just didn't see it as something that would tip the election. And in fairness, if you go back to the vice presidential debate, there was only one between Walz and Vice President Vance, now Vice President Vance, where Walz did not perform very well. The fraud issue didn't come up either by the moderators or by Vance. So even Republicans didn't really bring it up, which is really interesting. Instead, they focused a lot on his policies that he had passed related to gender transition for minors, tampons in young boys' locker rooms in schools, that kind of stuff that would really play with voters. And I guess, long story short, Republicans already had so much else to work with under the Biden presidency, the economy and immigration, that wasn't something that really tipped the scales.
Yeah, because I completely agree with you that it wasn't a big focus, but I think it's just because they had so much else to work with Tim Walz. I mean, you raised the gender transition thing. Like, he's bought in, it seemed to me, he's bought in because they're worried that Kamala Harris can't appeal to blue-collar, working-class white Democrats and swing voters like that. And they go, well, Tim Walz, he likes football. He used to be a coach. He looks fun. He looks like your uncle. But, the Republicans so quickly were able to get the tampon Tim name around America. It became such like a catch cry against him. It's just so bizarre to me that they would pick a vice president whose biggest, it's weird that his biggest scandal, the thing that undoes his entire career, the thing that besmirches him in the history books, isn't even the biggest attacking point against him in a presidential campaign. I don't really have a question there other than why Tim Walz?
I know it's really wild. Another thing is, I mentioned this, I believe, but she looked at his family. He has a couple kids. He's close with his wife, and that was seen as a strength for him. Because she is married. She got married when she was a little bit older. She has stepkids, so that was seen as something that could balance out the ticket, his tight knit family. But another thing that was really interesting is, one in the U.S., one of the biggest things that was a huge issue for him beyond the gender transition issue and just his, record for being a really progressive governor were some of his exaggerations about his military experience, which is a huge deal in the US to do that. So he said something, I'm paraphrasing here, but when he was running for governor in 2018, he made this comment where he said, the weapons of war that I carried in war. Now, he served in National Guard, which is a very respectable thing to do, but he was never deployed in a combat zone. So when you exaggerate your combat experience that you never actually had, that's a really big deal and does not play well with veterans, independent voters. But what was so interesting is I asked some former Kamala Harris campaign aides, did you guys find this? And they did not find that in their vetting, which, was really shocking because he said that in his 2018 race. So the fact that they didn't flag that, and when they got a press inquiry about it, they were shocked about it, was kind of alarming.
Yeah, that is absolutely bizarre. I'd say America has a lot of very interesting will be the Jermaine way of saying it, but a lot of weird people that nearly got to be vice president. A lot of very strange choices, and I'm just wondering where's Tim Walz going to rank in that? Because to me, this is a guy that literally, this is just me speaking here, but he seemed to literally get to within just a couple of swing states away from being vice president, purely because he once called Republicans weird a couple of times. Like, you think like in history, Dan Quayle can't spell potato, Sarah Palin, less said about that, the better. But does Tim Walz really like flare up as just, this will be a historical oddity that how close someone with this little experience and charm and ability got within vice presidency?
I certainly think that it should be. I think another thing to really underscore is, again, how few campaign reporters gave him a really hard time trying to unearth scandals about him, looking into the fraud scandals. My colleague Jim Garrity at National Review wrote a piece about the fraud, waste, and mismanagement under his, again, 2 terms of being governor. He wrote a piece, the week he was picked, but there are very few reporters who did that. Again, the number of times I read the word folksy to describe him in pieces in mainstream news outlets was alarming. He got pretty much a free pass. Again, this was a pretty quick presidential race, but I think moving forward, I asked some Democrats about what's next for him because he decided amid this fraud scandal not to run for another term as governor. I think he probably had a lot of Democrats chirping in his ear, you better leave office because we don't want to deal with this anymore. And I think a lot of people are really pleased that Amy Klobuchar, a current US Senator, is likely going to be the Democrats' gubernatorial nominee. Because without that, I think without like a strong candidate to succeed him, without clearing out the primary, I think there'd be a lot of frustrated Democrats who'd be speaking more publicly about how embarrassing he's been in the party.
Yeah. Yeah, you raised up the folksy thing. Like, I've literally never heard that word used to describe anything other than Tim Walz. Like, it's like a word that we just came up purely for the sake of this one presidential campaign. I just want to ask though, like, I don't know how much a vice president pick could actually swing an election. Like, I think it's all about the people at the top of the ticket. It's about who you connect with more. But I'm just thinking Tim Walz is brought on because you think that blue-collar Democrats are going to go for him. You think it's going to fill in a few gaps that Kamala Harris leaves. She doesn't go with Josh. If she went with Josh Shapiro instead and she, checked her ego, Josh checked his, they put together a united team, is it any different? Is it a closer election, or was Kamala always doomed to lose all the swing states?
I think she was probably always doomed just because Biden had polled so badly in so many polls, swing state polls for so long. His administration, the Biden-Harris administration, was seen as a disaster for on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the economy, and illegal immigration at the southern border. So that was always going to be tough to overcome. I think with somebody like Shapiro, he perhaps could have helped. I mean, I think Walz was just kind of seen as an embarrassment, sort of this kind of ridiculous character who played into Democrats being unserious and a lot of independent suburban voters just tiring with Democratic rule. But I think more than anything, she's probably always doomed. But like the rule of thumb when picking a vice president is you don't want somebody to hurt the ticket, and I think that Tim Walz did that.
Yeah, let's move over to Kamala Harris, because there was a report in Axios this week which really piqued my attention. She's looking like a 2028 contender. I'm just going to quote here. In a swing through the Deep South, she was greeted like a rock star by enthusiastic crowds of mostly black men and women and white women. Many told Axios they wanted her to run again in 2028. Harris's appearances, like early polling for the 2028 race, defied top Democrats' belief that she isn't popular with the party's base, and that people blame her for Trump's 2024 victory. Our one top Democrat aide told Axios Kamala hasn't accepted she's not running yet. Now, if I'm, JD Vance, if I'm Marco Rubio, if I'm, to be honest, literally anyone with a Republican membership, I can't believe this headline. I cannot believe my luck. Surely she can't be thinking of running again.
I mean, yeah, Republicans are practically salivating at the mouth thinking of the prospect of a Kamala Harris nomination. I think a key, thing to remember from that Axios, or a key line to remember from that Axios article is South Carolina. Now, remember, typically New Hampshire goes first. Its state law requires that it goes first. So they held this kind of unsanctioned primary last time around. But Joe Biden essentially pressured the party into putting South Carolina at the head of its nominating process on the primary calendar because he polled really well with black voters. Kamala Harris is half black, half Indian. Obviously, Black voters really like her. They want to see more of her. What's really interesting is this time around, the DNC actually just this past week got applications for first in the nation status. So it's unclear which state's going to go first, but that may, play a big factor in how and who's running, and how these people are going to be pitching their 2028 candidates are going to be pitching their campaigns. I think right now, genuinely, she doesn't know what she's going to do. I had a funny conversation with a former Harris advisor about 6 months ago in a green room, and they're talking about her 107 days memoir about her campaign. And so much of it, this former aide was saying, is just swiping at other Democrats who didn't endorse her, weren't enthusiastic about her, and just talking about the campaign, not really putting forward a like forward thinking vision for the party, which you're kind of supposed to do if you want to run for president again. I think that was puzzling to a lot of people in the Democratic Party, and a lot of people who are even close to her saw that as a missed opportunity. So I think, again, she's not sure what she's going to do, but Republicans would absolutely love her to be the nominee.
Yeah, you bring up the Joe Biden getting South Carolina up the ticket. Now, I kind of felt when Joe Biden was running, he was kind of like the Democrat machine's candidate. He's not Bernie Sanders. He's not going to do anything weird. He's our guy, and we're sort of going to tip the scales of what we can do just to make sure we get Biden over the line. Do you reckon Kamala has that pull with the Democratic apparatus? I mean, sure, this Axios report says that, maybe people don't hate her as much as we thought they did. But surely, at the top, people are going, she doesn't have it. She really hurt us in 2024. Why would we try and pull any levers to get her over the line? Aren't we better off with someone else?
I think that Democrats have a pretty strong bench in 2028. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who's making no secret that he wants to run for president. Andy Beshear, West Virginia governor, red state. Mark Kelly, a senator from purple state, Arizona. Wes Moore, a young Black Democratic governor of Maryland. That's just to name a few out of the many, many people who want to run. So I think there are a lot of donors who are just really embarrassed by the party's losses in 2024 and are going to be hesitant to give her money. I think, people are really frustrated by her and Biden. Remember, I mean, obviously Biden was such a disaster. He had to drop out of the race, but donors are so frustrated that by him and his administration that he's having a hard time even raising money to have a presidential library. Okay. That's how frustrated people are. Kamala Harris, a little bit of a different question. She was kind of saddled with the late nomination. But yeah, I think there's just going to be a lot of energy behind a lot of other candidates. So she'd struggle to get through that.
Yeah, let's talk about one of those other candidates that I think this guy, I think he could do it. So, as you say, Gavin Newsom, he is not making any sort of backtracking statements about his ambitions. It's quite clear what he's doing. I mean, I've seen him in Davos this week talking about how everyone's rolling over for Trump. I don't he's the governor. I don't know why he's there, but when there's all these other world leaders there, but he's making a name for himself. He's becoming part of the story. He's doing great PR for himself. I also thought it was interesting that he's got this podcast that he's doing, and it's the guests he's having on which really tell me that he's figured out a path. I mean, obviously he had Charlie Kirk on when he started the podcast, and recently he had Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro went back on his own platforms and said this about his experience, which I thought was interesting.
Had a little bit of time off camera with Gavin Newsom. I'd met him briefly before. And like most politicians, he's very good in person. I will say that just as a class of people, politicians in person, way better than politicians on camera, just generally speaking. And we all know a bunch of politicians. And I think that this is the general rule about literally all of them. So off camera, he's very friendly. He's very garrulous. He will kind of get a little more honest with you than he might in terms of his positions on camera.
I play that clip because I'm not surprised that he's a good schmoozer. I'm not surprised that he, off camera, likes to, reach out to people on the other side. But I think, one of the problems that Democrats and Republicans have had recently is the idea of just appealing to your base, the other side of the enemy. We don't care about them. I just want to get you guys. But when Gavin Newsom's out there putting Ben Shapiro on his podcast, which would infuriate some of his fans that he's even platforming someone like Ben Shapiro, but when he's putting Ben Shapiro on a podcast like that, and then Ben Shapiro does have the ability to walk away going, it was actually a pretty positive experience. He heard me out. We had some fun off camera. This is a guy, to me, Gavin Newsom, who's actively looking to extend his hand across the aisle and bring over a couple people that even people that aren't inclined to vote for him can at least go, I kind of like this guy, see where he's coming from, in a very, Bill Clinton-esque sort of way of just, well, everyone likes him. Maybe not everyone wants to vote for him, but everyone kind of likes him.
I don't know if everybody likes him, but I think people certainly respect that he's engaging in this kind of, I don't know if I'd say friendly, but combat with his political adversaries. Look, he's seen as this extremely, he's this operator, right? He's got slicked back hair, he's tall, he's got the pearly white fake teeth, which probably, gives some people the used car salesman sort of vibe. But he's seen as somebody who just wants to be president so badly and has wanted it forever, having held a bunch of different statewide, I think he was also mayor of San Francisco as well. But look, I think moving forward, the Democratic base is just craving somebody who's going to fight Trump. Obviously Trump ended up sweeping all 7 battlegrounds, won the popular vote for the first time in 20 years. But now Republicans got a little bit complacent. Obviously, the polls are not looking good for them. So now they just want somebody who's going to fight Trump at every turn. Look at Gavin Newsom. He's somebody whose gamble on decade redistricting really paid off in California. Republicans started that in Texas because Republicans are so paranoid about losing the House because Trump doesn't want to get impeached again and have everybody in his cabinet investigated by a Democrat-run House. But that seems to have backfired, and that's in part because Gavin Newsom was such an operator, and his gambit really played off. And now Republicans are set to lose a ton of congressional seats in his state. So I think they're looking at him and saying, okay, he took a risk there, and it paid off, and he's somebody who can fight Trump and win.
Yeah. So one thing with Gavin Newsom, I find, there's a lot of high information voters out there, and we live in the high information voter world. We're constantly analysing the day-to-day politics. But there are a whole lot of people that sort of just around election day sort of sum up who do they like more personally and vote accordingly. I think it's a bigger issue here in Australia because we have compulsory voting. People have to vote than it is America where people can just stay home if they wanted. But the reason I bring this up is because the next election, especially the midterms, but probably the next presidential election, is really going to be fought on cost of living. We've seen Zoran Mamdani get to New York. We've seen Trump really hammer down on affordability is a big issue after saying that it wasn't a big issue. I just wonder, does Gavin Newsom just look too rich to ever appeal to voters who are struggling with their hip pocket? He's got LA millionaire face, and I don't know how he overcomes that.
That's actually a really great question, and you're hitting the nail on the head. There's something about Gavin Newsom that's just a little bit off-putting, where it's like, this guy is just kind of just too slick for me. And I think that there are going to be a lot of voters who do wrestle with that. And I think looking beyond that smart question of yours, another thing is Republicans are saying, okay, California is a disaster. Some of the look at the wildfire rebuilding and the disastrous permitting process where after these horrible fires in the Palisades and middle class neighborhood Altadena, which gets no attention from the media, they're having so much struggle rebuilding there. There's a ton of homelessness in California. It's extremely expensive. They're considering a billionaire tax there, which a lot of Republicans think would cause a lot more people to flee California. So I think he's going to have a tough time kind of answering for his record, but for now he's counting on his wins to propel him forward.
Are there any other Democrat names we haven't mentioned in this interview that you would say, hang on, watch out for this person, they could make a splash here?
I think it'll be interesting to see whether Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer makes a play. Another one is I mentioned the Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. His fellow Senator Ruben Gallego is also likely to run for president. Ro Khanna, a high-profile congressman from California. I think Gavin Newsom's probably going to outshine him, but he's somebody with a lot of ambitions. Look, I think the list of Democrats is going to be extremely, extremely long. And you compare that with who's likely to run for president on the Republican side, you're going to see probably a lot fewer candidates because J.D. Vance is seen as somebody who's kind of the heir apparent, or somebody like Marco Rubio, who has really endeared himself to Trump clearly on the foreign policy side of things. So yeah, really deep bench for Democrats. And I think a lot of Democrats are just really eager to see who emerges.
Yeah. Can I throw one more name in there? Because Look, she's young, she's radical, she might not be where the voters are going, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if that next election is run on cost of living, affordability, capitalism's not working for America anymore, we need a new way of thinking. You know, you never know where the world is going to go. She's obviously got quite a long career in politics ahead of her, but I just think moment in time, this might, like 2028 might actually be her best shot at it.
I think you're actually right. A lot of people have been wondering whether she'll run against Chuck Schumer or if Chuck Schumer runs for reelection. He may actually not do that. He's getting on the older side, Senate Democrats leader. So she may run for Senate, but I think you're right. This is her time to shine. Fighting against the billionaires, fighting for, Medicare for all. I think that would be resonant with a lot of people. Remember, Bernie almost won the nomination in 2016. He's extremely far left. A lot of super delegates and the DNC made sure that Hillary Clinton would win. But the fact that that Hillary Clinton would win the nomination, but the fact that Bernie Sanders almost won means that it's not crazy for a self-styled Democratic socialist to win the nomination. I'm glad you mentioned her. I'm embarrassed that I forgot her name.
No, it's all good. But
definitely keep an eye on her. Yeah.
But the other thing with Bernie Sanders, right? So he went on cost of living, America, capitalism's not working for us. We need to think about young people. He was saying that as like a, at least 65. I don't know how old he was at the time, but that was an old man that was speaking to young people in America about what they're going through. And it's still connected, which is something that I didn't think would, you want to hear the message from someone that kind of looks like you and kind of experiences what you're experiencing. For a guy, I've been in Congress, I've been in Washington, D.C. for 50 years, and I want to change things. That doesn't hit, but it did. So I just think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's young, she looks like a Democrat voter. I think that message would be even more powerful coming from her in 2028 than Bernie Sanders in 2016.
I think you're right. And another thing to remember is you kind of mentioned this might be her time to run. If she doesn't run this time around, she may never get it. Look, if you look at Chris Christie, remember he was polling really well against Obama, and then he decided against running. He missed his moment. Then he ran for president, several times after that, and obviously it didn't go anywhere. So I feel like the lesson from that moment, and this has happened to a bunch of other candidates who've kind of, been a star, but then they fizzled out. If it is your moment and you feel it, you've got to go for it. And I think also another name I forgot, J.B. Pritzker, governor of Illinois, used to be a little bit on the chunkier side, clearly is using a GLP-1. You laugh at it, but it's a sign that somebody's thinking of running. We're seeing some makeovers in the party, something to pay attention to. So if somebody's losing a lot of weight, chances are they're thinking about 2028.
Yeah, just a naked Australian thing. So our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, same sort of thing. He lost a lot of weight and people were like, this might be for real. And it was. So, look, Audrey, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. That was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was so fun.
Thank you for watching this full interview. Make sure you are subscribed to Sky News Australia so you can stay up to date with future videos, other videos from myself, and of course, the other videos from all the excellent commentators we have here at Sky News Australia.